The Caro Kann is often considered a bit of a beginner opening since it can be relatively simple in lots of cases. However, in the two games that I'm about to show you, the best player in the world, undoubtedly Magnus Carlsen, uses the Caro Kann against Alireza Firouzja and Fabiano Caruana, two other of the best players in the world right now, and plays it in an incredibly interesting way in both games, both completely different. So let's jump into it. We have, obviously, the Caro Kann. So we have d5, and Fabi opts for the advanced variation. Magnus plays bishop to f5, and after knight to d2, this is a really interesting line of the advanced variation, which I'm starting to see more around the sort of 2300 blitz level on chess.com. Now, what does knight d2 do? Well, it looks like a bit of a strange move at first, but after pawn e6, the plan for black is to play pawn c5. That's kind of the point of the advanced Caro Kann from the black perspective. Get the bishop outside the pawn chain, lock the pawn chain shut once the bishop has escaped, and then play pawn c5 to break white's pawn chain. That's just kind of what you do. But the point of knight d2, knight d2, is to play knight to b3, to clamp down on the c5 square. And you don't really want to go b6 to prepare c5 in these sorts of lines because you leave lots of holes on the light squares. And because this bishop can't come back to defend the light squares, it's not really very viable. Like, let's say, I don't know, knight f3, pawn c5. After pawn c4, black is already in a lot of trouble. Bishop b5 check is also very legitimate. Something like knight d7 takes, let's say, pawn takes. After castles, I mean, c4 is probably on the way. It's also unclear how black is going to develop his pieces properly, because if he develops the knight, his bishop will no longer be guarding c5. So let's say like knight e7, just knight c5, and the game is over. Of course, Magnus knows this, so he goes knight d7, which is the main move. If white is going to do this maneuver to stop pawn c5, then black will go knight d7 to add more support to c5. So we have knight to f3, we have pawn to a6, which isn't necessary, but it is often played regardless, whether before or after c5, because this diagonal can get a bit weak. And if you were to play like c5 immediately, it's like, oh, you know, after takes, you can't really take with the knight very easily, because there could be issues with, like, take, and bishop b5 check, and then you have to go king f8. And the engine will say this is okay, but, like, do you really want to have a king on f8? Up to you. So we have pawn a6, stopping any bishop b5 ideas. We have bishop to e2 and pawn c5 on the board. Now, white never really wants to take on c5. This just helps black to develop very easily, something like bishop c5. Black could give up the bishop pair after something like takes, castles, something like knight e7, let's say, I don't know, bishop to e3, knight back to d7, pawn c3, castles. This is a very fine line for black to go for, and there could be issues with the e5 pawn after something like knight to c6, maybe queen c7, and it could be quite difficult to defend. So we have pawn c3 from Fabi, just securing the center. And the game gets really interesting. After pawn h6, white castles, Magnus goes pawn c4, which is the best move. Now, typically, this is not a very good move from a positional perspective, because by playing pawn c4, Magnus can no longer break open the white center, because c5 was the pawn break to break open the center. By going c4, he kicks the knight back, and he goes pawn b5. And instead of going for some kind of central skirmish, Magnus completely closes up the center of the board and instead decides, okay, I'm going to play on the queen side, which is fascinating because normally this is not how, like, these positions tend to go. So Fabi plays the best move, knight back to e1, potentially preparing f4, also preparing to bring the knight over to c2 to help to guard the b4 square. Magnus goes knight to e7, just developing. We have knight c2, bishop back to h7, which bishop h7 is a bit of an interesting move because, I mean, the thing is, it is the best move, and you might be wondering why. My guess would be that if knight c6, g4 could be a problem, like alongside f4. Something like here. Okay, apparently not. Why is f4 immediately good? Why is this good immediately? And if something like rook b8, then... Oh, knight e3 first hitting the bishop, and then the bishop moves, and then f5. Okay, that makes sense. So this is kind of white's way to counterattack, because sometimes it's done using g4 and f5, so I was unsure as to what the exact idea is, but it seems to be the culmination of this knight maneuver supporting the f5 push. So Magnus drops his bishop back immediately. Here the best move is pawn to f4, but now f5 is very well covered, and after something like knight to b6, if knight to e3 is played, Magnus can just go knight to f5, offering a knight trade, and after something like takes and takes, you still have to watch for like g4, bishop back, and f5. It's still a legitimate attack for white, and Magnus would have to watch out. By the way, I'm showing you all these lines because they will be helpful in your own games, particularly based on my own experience with the Caro, because I've faced these kinds of ideas before, so I'm trying to show you that they exist. So Fabi goes f4. We have pawn to h5 from Magnus, gambiting the h5 pawn, except it can't really be taken because a bishop takes c2 and the queen is overloaded. Fabi can try bishop f7 check, king f7, and queen c2. He has 2 pawns for a piece, but after something like g6, the knight might come into f5, again, watching for g4. But, I mean, two pawns for a piece just isn't going to be enough here. So we have pawn g3, just securing the pawn chain. It seems a little bit unnecessary, to be fair. The engine wants rook f3, looking for a rook lift, which is a bit strange, to be fair. But we have pawn g3, and Magnus takes on c2, which is the best move. So after takes and takes, what does Magnus accomplish? Well, he goes g6. And why does he want to go g6? Well, here he obviously can't go g6 because he blocks in his bishop. But by trading off the bishop, giving Fabi the bishop pair, and then closing everything, Fabi has every single pawn, apart from a2, on a dark square, so this bishop kind of sucks. Magnus has every single pawn on a light square, but he traded off his light square bishop, so he doesn't really have any major problems, and it's going to be very difficult for white to ever push for a win here, but Fabi will certainly try. So we have knight to f3, bringing the knight closer to the action, maybe going to hop into g5. We have knight to f5, which is a very good square for the knight. If you try this in your own games in the advanced variation, it's very, very good. You have to watch for a bishop taking, but as you can see, this bishop can't come to d3 or g4. And you also have to watch for pawn to g4, which has been stopped by this pawn being on g5. This is a very common structure. So we have bishop to d2, bishop to e7, king to g2, and knight to b6. So b4 will happen at some point. It's been looming for a long time, but it will happen eventually. There's no major rush, though, because of how close the position is. Here after h3, Magnus goes pawn to h4. We have pawn to g4 and knight into g3, forking the rook and the bishop. And this is quite dangerous. Now, this pawn is somewhat tender, because it can't really be supported with a pawn on g5, but it is protected 3 different ways, so it is, like, pretty much fine. We have rook fe1 from Fabi, pawn a5, preparing pawn to b4. Here, if a move like a3 is played, which is fine, b4 could still be played, and after something like ab4, rook a8, queen a8, and cb4, Fabi goes up a pawn, but, I mean, the engine here suggests king d7, which is a bit ridiculous. I assume trying to bring the rook into the game. But after something like queen a2, this does look rather nice for Magnus. If, like, queen b1 looking for a queen trade, okay, you actually can't do that because the bishop hangs, so that doesn't even work. I mean, these pawns are not particularly impressive, although Fabi is up a pawn. But we have bishop back to d1, ensuring the bishop is no longer going to be a target, which is the best move. If this bishop can come to c2, it could be actually a decent piece, and maybe even prepare f5 in the future, which is still an idea. We have pawn b4 from Magnus, striking on the queen side, which is the culmination of this c4 move, really. Pushing c4 and locking the center makes no sense without b4 eventually coming. So we have b4, queen back to c1, queen to d7, rook to e3, just lending more support to the c3 pawn. If this is taken, I mean, bc3 is the best move, but you could also probably take with the bishop, for example, and be completely fine. We have rook b8 from Magnus, just adding a bit more pressure down the file. Bishop back to e1, challenging the knight, and the knight hops over to e4, hitting c3, and this bishop is monitoring the knight pretty well, stopping all of its forward movement, but it's difficult to get rid of the knight. So we have bishop c2, applying pressure to the knight, and, you know, technically threatening to win a pawn, and Magnus just ignores him with knight to a4, which is the best move. Now, what happens if bishop e4? Which is a fine move. So, okay, bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and rook takes e4. Doesn't Fabi just go up a pawn? Well, here queen c6 is pretty strong. You can see there's a lot of targets on this diagonal, but it's like, okay, yeah, well, the rook just moves, and then what? I mean, c3 is defended enough, so taking makes no sense. Here, the engine likes knight back to b6, and it doesn't quite seem clear why Magnus gives up a pawn. But after, I mean, rook f2 is the best move. Let's just say rook f2 happens. Queen to e4 infiltrates. I assume the knight might want to hop into d5. So, like, okay, yeah, sure, that makes sense. What about something like rook b1? Pretty inconspicuous. Not allowing not allowing the queen into e4. Here after knight d5, Magnus is apparently just better. Let's say rook back to a1. Here, now the engine wants bc3, and after bc3 and pawn a4, yes, Magnus is down a pawn, but I suppose the problem for Fabi is that this knight can't really do anything, and Magnus's knight, by sacrificing a pawn, is actually quite strong. c3 is going to be a weakness, and if this pawn comes to a3, there could be infiltrations on a square like b2, for example. It's unclear, though, for sure. Anyways, we have rook b1, which is the best move. We have bc3, bc3, and castles kingside. By castling kingside, Magnus is kind of offering the pawn on h4. Now, what happens if this pawn is taken? Well, if the knight takes on h4, then bishop h4, and knight a takes c3. Okay, the engine just changed its mind. It's kind of flip-flopping on me. Okay, it also doesn't like this. No, okay, it wants to take immediately. Okay, that makes sense. And then if the bishop takes, the knight takes, the rook takes on b1, the queen, let's say queen takes b1, bishop h4. We have an opposite colored bishop position, which looks slightly concerning after pawn g5. It looks like the bishop could be trapped. Although there is, I suppose, king g7, rook h8, or queen a7, looking at the dark squares, preparing rook to b8. And this protected passed c pawn is far, far stronger than this pawn on h3. So, effectively, Magnus is offering a trade of the h-pawn for the c-pawn, which is way better for Magnus, because then this pawn becomes a passed pawn, and this h-pawn is way too far away. It could come to h5, but that'll take a long time, although that happens later on. So we have rook b2, which, by opening up the b file, Magnus is preparing to double up, so Fabi kind of has to take the rook to avoid the double up. We have knight takes b2. This pawn on c3 is not going anywhere, and still the question remains, can Fabi take on e4? Well, here, of course, the queen hangs, so, I mean, no, not yet. Queen e2. We have rook to b8. Can Fabi take on e4? Again, no. After takes and takes, if the rook takes, knight d3, and rook to b2 is a major, major threat, pinning the queen. And you could block it with the bishop or the knight, I suppose. So let's say king back to g1 even, rook to b2. The queen can move, or you can block. But the problem is this a2 pawn, and then the a pawn is going to march through and promote, and you can never push d5 to create counterplay, because it's very well controlled. So, basically, this bishop has to just sit there and try to monitor both of these knights at once. Fabi takes on h4, and this is losing. Now, Magnus doesn't play the best move with knight d3. The best move is a bit ridiculous. You can pause the video and try to find it if you want. But it is, yeah, really crazy. It's pawn g5. So, okay, what does pawn g5 do? Well, we're attacking the knight, so white has two options. Either he moves the knight, or he takes the pawn. So the first move, of course, is, okay, what happens if you take? Well, bishop takes, hits the rook, the knight is still under attack. Okay, well, if you move the rook, because the knight is defended, well, here, knight d3 is apparently very, very strong. And okay, I mean, technically nothing is hanging, but this rook is coming to b2, and there are a lot of targets, and this knight can always take on d1. So basically, I think the issue is that this bishop is defending the knight, the queen is defending the bishop, and the queen is defending this bishop, but this rook is going to come and bulldoze everything. And if you take on d3, then after takes, and rook takes, there is no rook to b2 anymore, but the engine likes rook b1, putting pressure on the bishop, or queen a4, just applying pressure and stopping any c4 ideas. I mean, even something like queen a3 and rook b2 looks very strong. Even though it's slow, it doesn't seem to be a good way to stop it. Even so, had they seen this position, I mean, Fabi is up 2 pawns, and it's not 100% clear why this is -2. So, and this is a rapid game, by the way. So instead, we have knight into d3 from Magnus. The engine calls it a miss, but after bishop d3, cd3, queen d3, Fabi is now up 2 pawns, the pawn on h4 and this pawn taking on d3. But after rook b2 check, rook e2 and queen to b7, the best move supporting the rook, Magnus has enough compensation to the point where he's actually slightly better. And the reasons that I believe this is 1, the weakness of a2, 2, the weakness of c3, 3, the weakness of the second rank in general and the white king, and also the fact this knight is a bit awkward. So here Fabi goes knight back to f3, which makes sense because the knight was under attack. We have pawn to a4, best move from Magnus. And okay, well, this pawn is defended for now, and if Magnus, after h4, takes the rook, then after queen takes, I mean, the queen could come to a square like b1 maybe, but this pawn is still defended. There's no obvious way through. So, okay, after h4, we have pawn a3, the best move supporting the rook. Now taking the rook is effectively unthinkable because of a takes b2. And this pawn is going to be way too strong. The queen is going to be stranded on the b1 square. And if I was playing this, I'd probably just go bishop a3. So the bishop supports the pawn, traps this queen. The queen can't do anything. And then we can bring our queen into the position in a different manner. And, I mean, it's basically queen and knight versus knight and bishop. This queen is being kept out of the game by the bishop and the pawn. So you can't take the rook anymore. And we have pawn h5, which is a good move, trying to create a passed pawn. And Magnus obliges with takes and takes. Here we have rook takes e2, queen takes e2, and queen to b2. You can't take the queen, of course, because after ab2, you don't have knight to e2 defending because you just take it and then you promote. So instead we have king f1, unpinning the queen. If you take this queen, then after king takes, white is completely winning because he is up 2 pawns. And it's very difficult to win this pawn for black because you can't go knight f6 or knight g3 attacking the pawn. And this pawn, it could actually be a weakness because the white king can just march over there. So we have queen to c1. And the position is equal, but Magnus is down 2 pawns, and yet the position is equal, which effectively means that he has 2 points worth of compensation, which is a lot. This king is weak, this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak, this pawn could be strong, but also could be weak. Fabi gives a check, we have king to h7. Here, Fabi is actually better if he finds pawn to f5, which he doesn't find. Here, after queen f4, applying pressure takes. If you take back, then queen g6 could be pretty devastating. So, I mean, Magnus would have to find knight g5, which looks incredibly chaotic. And this isn't even clear as to who's winning anyway, because of all the pressure on this knight. So, we instead of pawn h6, threatening checkmate in 1, which effectively forces Magnus to take the pawn. Fabi gives a check, the king runs to g7. Fabi gives a check, the king runs to f8. Here the only move is pawn to f5, trying to create some chaos, but we have queen h2, allowing the king to run to e8. And after the queen goes back to g2, Magnus takes on f4. The problem is that this queen has so many jobs. the queen has to defend a2 and defend f4, and it just can't really do everything. I mean, the engine here suggests king e2, which is ridiculous. I mean, who is playing king to e2 and then wants to play king e3 eventually? It's a bit strange. So we have queen g2, queen takes f4. Magnus is now equal in material, and that's why it's -2, because Magnus already had 2 points worth of compensation for Fabi's 2 pawns, except Fabi has now lost those 2 pawns, so Magnus just has the compensation positionally. We have king e2, queen back to c1, applying a lot of pressure. King f1, Fabi plays on, but at this point, the bishop blocks on f8, the queen goes back to g2. This knight is just so strong. Knight takes c3. You, of course, can't take because of the pin. We have queen to f2. The knight comes back with tempo. The queen moves again. Bishop to b4, applying more pressure. And after king to g2, queen c2, king h3. The game goes on a little bit. Takes and takes. Queen takes a2. But Magnus is up 2 pawns now, and this pawn is going to be the deciding factor. Fabi, of course, could try to trap the black king. Like if Magnus plays a bad move, like king e7, I mean, maybe there's some chances of a perpetual, but even here, I mean, the king can run, and this knight is amazing, stopping the queen from giving any more checks. We have queen f2, queen takes e2, queen c1, queen f2, and in this position, Fabi resigns because checkmate is threatened, the knight is also threatened, and if you play a move like queen to f4 trying to stop both threats, amongst other things, just pawn a2. And the queen can't stop the promotion, defend the knight, and defend checkmate. So that, I thought, was a fascinating game, because this whole idea of going c4 and playing on the queen side like this is so rare in the Caro. It's really rare to not trade any pawns in the center and just go for like a queenside pawn storm like this. Second game, though, this is more tactical in nature. So the first one was more positional. This is more tactical. So we have, of course, the Caro. We again have the advanced variation, which is what most grandmasters play against the Caro. It's considered the best way to fight for an advantage. We have bishop f5, h4, and the reason I included this game is because here everybody plays h5. It's the best move. It's what I recommend in my Caro Kann course. Except Magnus goes c5, which is like, I don't know, it feels blasphemous, because normally, if you're going to go c5, you do it here. And then if knight to f3, you know, you get cd4 and knight d4, something like this, knight c6, I don't know. I used to play this line myself with black, but I started playing bishop f5. But going c5, I mean, is kind of crazy. The point is, if pawn g4, which is the normal idea of the tile attack, then simply bishop back to d7. And it's like, okay, why are these pawns over here? There's no bishop to be targeting anymore on the king side, coming back to g6 or anything. And now after something like dc5, pawn e6, white has basically wasted moves, and these pawns are in need of protection. But it's not clear how both are going to be protected, like bishop e3, knight c6, let's say knight to f3. Here, pawn f6 is quite strong, but even like queen c7 should be fine. But we have dc5, knight c6, so Magnus applies pressure to e5. Okay. Firouzja pins the knight to the king, which is the best move. We have queen c7, applying pressure to the e5 pawn. Firouzja simply defends the e5 pawn. By the way, if queen takes on d5, pawn e6 comes with tempo on the queen, and after something like takes, and queen back to d4, the queen does keep an eye on both pawns, but Magnus gets a decent amount of activity. The engine says this is much better for white, but it's not 100% clear how white actually maintains the advantage. Like, if you don't play knight f3 here, you give the advantage away with white, basically. So we have knight to f3, which is much more simple. We have pawn e6, applying pressure to c5. And now, by making Firouzja play knight to f6, there's no g4. So the bishop is perfectly fine, because the queen is cut off from defending g4. I've never seen the tile attack played in this way, which is why I'm showing you this, because I just think it's fascinating, and the game gets better. So we have bishop e3, defending the pawn in the traditional manner. b4 was also a move. We have bishop g4, which is a common way in some advanced Caro Kanns to justify this bishop, where if you develop it before the knight develops, you can't put it on g4 because the queen controls g4. But if you wait for knight to f3, then you can play it in some lines. And of course, this is simply threatening something like takes, takes, and takes, although c4 could be interesting. But we have knight bd2, simply defending the knight. We have knight to h6, and Magnus is offering to ruin his pawn structure. But this actually isn't all that good for Firouzja. If something like castles, for example, after bishop c5, Magnus has full compensation for the ruined pawn structure, because he's got the bishop pair. The open g-file could be quite useful. He can probably even just castle queenside in some lines, although the engine says just castle kingside, bro. Like, after pawn c3, engine just wants to castle kingside. It just doesn't care. I mean, the pawn on h5, because there's no pawn h3, because this pawn is on h4, with a pawn on h5, this bishop is going to be perfectly fine and can sit there forever, really. So we have pawn c3, not taking the knight. We have knight to f5, attacking the bishop. So the bishop goes to d4, which is the traditional way to play in this structure in the advanced Caro Kann. Very normal. If you've watched some of my older videos, you'll have seen people play this type of thing against me. And I've actually played this kind of thing on stream against some of my viewers on, well, I was on the white side of it. And the point is, if you take the bishop, then obviously cd4, and you secure the extra pawn. Remember, Firouzja is up a pawn. So we have bishop to e7, queen to a4, unpinning the knight and applying pressure to this knight. Also be aware there could be issues with this bishop if this bishop moves, although the bishop can always take on f3. So we have castles, bishop c6, bc6, and knight to h2 attacking the bishop. Here, Magnus takes on d4. The engine is not a fan of this. It really wants pawn h5, which looks like it's trapping the bishop after pawn f3. But there is actually bishop h4, and after king d1 only move, knight g3. And if you take the bishop, then Magnus takes on h1. And the game gets a bit crazy after something like knight to f3, bishop g3. It looks like this knight could be trapped, but maybe it can get away, like king e2 stopping it from getting away. It's still unclear. I mean, like hg4, rook h1, gf3, knight f3. Maybe Magnus is just getting checkmated if this queen comes over here. It's not clear, but very interesting. So Magnus takes on d4, which the engine calls an inaccuracy, but only because Magnus didn't see that entire line that I just showed you. So we have queen d4, bishop back to f5, which looks much more natural, and pawn g4, going for the pawn storm. And here, Magnus plays f6. Now, I'm sure Magnus probably knew that the better move would be to save the bishop, and after something like rook c1, bishop e4, knight e4, d e4, queen e4, then the bishop can take on c5, most likely. And okay, Firouzja's still up a pawn, but his king kind of makes no sense. Why is the knight on h2? There could be counterplay down the d-file, for example. But Magnus just sacrifices the bishop with pawn f6. Now, if you take on f6, then Magnus is much better. After bishop f6 hitting the queen moves, then the bishop moves, and it has a way out of the position. If you try taking on e6, something like bishop to f7, let's say queen to f5, rook to e8 check, and the white king is completely stranded. And also h4 hangs, the knight again makes no sense. So basically, Firouzja has to accept the bishop. So we have fe5 hitting the queen moves, and rook takes f5. So okay, what's the material count? Well, Magnus has a pawn for a knight. He has a pawn for a knight. How on earth do you justify this? Well, Firouzja cannot castle kingside. If Firouzja castles kingside, I mean, he's going to get checkmated. Like, all these pieces are going to come into the game and checkmate the white king. Most likely. So, okay, he goes queenside, which is the best idea. And after rook 8 to f8, okay, I mean, Magnus is activating his pieces, but at the end of the day, Firouzja's got an extra knight. So we have pawn f3, stopping rook f2, obviously. We have bishop takes h4, which is an insane move, like opening up the h-file voluntarily for a pawn. Although, you know, if the bishop comes to g5 and f4, it could actually be quite strong. So we have rook d to g1, stopping bishop to g5. I assume if you play a move like king b1, yeah, the engine likes, okay, it wants bishop g3 instead. And then let's say knight g4 for the sake of argument. Okay, it does like putting the bishop on f4, so that's that does make sense. And then, you know, the pawn supports the bishop supports the pawn, the bishop monitors a very, very useful position on the board, and it can never be attacked by another pawn, because there's no e-pawn or g-pawn. So we have rook d to g1, stopping that. We have queen to e7, putting pressure on the pawn, also preparing bishop to g4 by adding another defender. We have knight g4. Sorry, bishop g5, not bishop g4. We have bishop g5, queen e2, and queen takes c5. So Magnus, by taking on h4 and c5, ends up getting 3 pawns for the knight. Technically, material is equal. But Firouzja is still much better, because the extra pawns aren't that important, because they're castles on opposite sides of the board, and Magnus's entire kingside could come crashing down. So if king b1, and Firouzja gives the game away. Now, that's slightly exaggerated. I mean, the engine wants knight e5. And I mean, it looks kind of scary to be, you know, potentially bishop d2, because you can't take with the queen, because then rook e5, so the king would have to take, and maybe this kind of spooked Firouzja, which, I mean, makes sense, right? When you've got the best player in the world bringing your king into the open, maybe it could be a problem. Maybe d4 is a problem, I don't know. But we have king b1, and here the best move for Magnus would be h5, which is just insane, attacking the knight. And it's like, okay, well, surely rook h5. Well, here, queen g1. Okay, right, so surely knight to e5. Why is Magnus encouraging this? But then bishop d2, and the king doesn't defend the knight anymore. So that's what the engine wants. It wants to encourage knight takes e5. But Magnus goes bishop f4, which I think is far more logical, just defending the e-pawn. We have knight to b3 attacking the queen. The queen goes back to e7. The engine hates this, by the way. It wants queen b6. And after something like, I don't know, rook e1, preparing to take at some point maybe. Here again it wants h5, which is just a bit insane. And after knight e3, queen e3, bishop e3, rook e3. You can't even take on f3 because of this, but the engine thinks after king h7 that black can hold with the 3 pawns for the knight. But Magnus doesn't play like that. We have queen e7, knight to f2, and pawn c5, looking for, well, you'd assume pawn c4. So we have pawn c4 from Firouzja instead. Magnus goes pawn a5, offering the pawn on a5, which Firouzja takes, and plays queen a7, hitting the knight. So, okay, the knight retreats, makes sense, rook a8, and, okay, this is quite weak, and you can't go knight c1 to defend, because the bishop will take. But pawn a3, the knight is destabilized, so he attacks it with queen b6. But after king a2, everything is kind of held together, right? I mean, c4 is defended, the knight is defended. We have rook b8, but after queen c2, c4 is still defended, the knight is still defended. This bishop can't really help much in the attack for the time being, because the light squares are what we're contesting. So surely Firouzja now just has a knight for 2 pawns. And, you know, in endgames, the a-pawn will be a passed pawn. But we have bishop e3. Okay, that makes sense, yeah, trying to deflect the queen, because let's say white plays a silly move, like taking on d5, then bishop f2, and you can't take because of this. Basically, the queen is overloaded. So, okay, we have rook g2 defending the knight and unpinning, which makes sense. We have pawn to e4. Okay, you can't take this, because then the knight hangs. We can all understand that. Although the engine thinks that after rook f2, bishop f2, ed5, that white is still much better. There's a lot of chess to be played in this position, though. We have knight g4, attacking the bishop. And the game turns into a bit of a slugfest. We have dc4. And here, there is only one move to save the game for white. If you take this pawn on c4, then rook f4 is the idea. h7 can't be taken, because then the queen will hang. And the queen obviously can't take the rook because it's defended. The knight can't be taking because of this. And the queen has to be careful where she goes, because the knight needs defending. But after something like queen d3, there's queen b3, and after queen b3, rook b3, the knight is under attack. And if you take the rook, then after, I mean, c4 is technically the best move, but let's just say rook takes g4. Magnus has, I mean, let's say rook to h7 is played. Magnus has 2 pawns and a bishop for the rook, but this f-pawn is a monster, and there's not a good way to stop it. So knight to a1 is losing. The only move is knight a5, which looks like it just gives away a knight. But the bishop is hanging. So it's a bit of a crazy move. And the point is that if this knight lands on c4, I mean, everything is protected, basically. And everything is also under attack. So that would be a monster knight. So Magnus doesn't have to deal with that, because Fabi goes knight back to a1. Which is very natural. And, Firouzja, not Fabi. Here we have bishop d4, making sure the bishop is no longer hanging and attacking the b2 pawn. We have rook to c1, pawn to f2. Now there is another avenue of attack. We have rook b1 trying to defend. But I mean, going rook c1 and then rook b1, I mean, what does that indicate? It kind of just means that Firouzja doesn't have any moves. This knight can't move. It can't go to c2 because of the queen. Can't go to c4 because of the pawn. And, I mean, unless the queen takes, then the knight's not going to get out. We have queen f1, promoting. Sorry, pawn to f1, promoting to a queen. Rook takes f1. Rook takes f1. Magnus wins a rook. And this is basically game over. Firouzja tries to counterattack with queen h7 and queen back to c2, because there's just not any useful checks. If, like, queen to h5 check, king e7, queen h4 check, king d6, queen g3 check, pawn e5, and the checks are done. That's it. Unless you're going to sack your queen. But there's just checkmate is coming. Checkmate is coming. And the thing is, like, what is the threat of checkmate? I mean, let's say that queen comes to c2 or g2. It's queen b3, sacking the queen for checkmate, which is kind of crazy. So we have queen c2, king e7. Sorry, no we don't. We have queen h7, sorry. King f7, queen c2, king e7, rook e2, trying to counterattack again. We have queen b2, rook b2, bishop b2, and king b2. And in true Carlsen fashion, he trades everything off, has a rook versus 2 knights, except he is up 3 pawns in the end, and the knights are not going to be enough to stop it. White somewhat pulls the game back, but, I mean, realistically, this is such a simple position for Magnus. Literally just throw the pawn down the board, stop the a-pawn. The rook is amazing, just cutting everything off, defending c4. And after Magnus wins the a-pawn, that's basically it. g2, we have knight g2, which is forced because otherwise the pawn will promote. And after rook g2, Firouzja resigns because, I mean, you're not going to stop 2 pawns and a rook with the knight. And after something like king c4, it looks like he might be winning c5, because if king to b6, you know, knight d7 winning the pawn, technically that is correct. Except Magnus doesn't even need to give away the pawn, just rook to c2, king b3, and the pawn is well protected. I mean, you know, I don't know, rook c1, maybe there's complications with knight d3, but it doesn't really look like it. There is c4 here, actually. But yeah. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know you guys have been enjoying the Vincent Keymer ones, so I wanted to show some Magnus ones because, yeah, I mean, similar to Keymer, he plays some very interesting lines off the Caro, which I just don't see very often. I really don't, and I think there's a lot to be learned from these Grandmaster games. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.